Hello and welcome to game 39 of the TCEC Premier Division, in which we have a clash between Leela and another female engine called AllieStein. This is a co-production between Adam Treat, who wrote the AllieChess engine, and Mark Jordan, who trained the supervised neural net from millions of computer games. This is different from Leela in that Leela is generating her own games that she's training on, while the AllieStein net, also used in Leela, is trained on already existing games played by other chess engines. They played the Sicilian, and on move 3 they entered a Morozzi bind setup with c4, a6, knight c3, queen c7. White would like to play here e5 to annoy the knight on g8 and control d6, but it wouldn't be very good now because of knight c6 and the pawn would be lost. So instead Leela continues with bishop e2, knight c6, d4. This has to be played before black prevents it with knight d4. Pawn takes, knight f6, Leela castles, and the book moves end with bishop b4. Leela played now knight a4, threatening to cut the bishop's route back home with c5, and then try to trap the bishop with a3 and b4. This leaves e4 undefended, and black could take the pawn now, but it's not advised to lose even more time when you're behind in development. After bishop f3, if the knight retreats for example, c5 is already very painful for black. a3 and b4 is threatened. AllieStein doesn't want his bishop on the wrong side of the board after c5, so he just retreats the bishop back to e7. Leela plays c5 anyway, and probably intended to handle knight takes on e4 with knight takes on c6, b takes, queen d4 with a double attack on the knight and g7, forcing the knight back to f6, and then bishop f4, and black wouldn't be very happy in that position. Knight b6 can come, bishop e5, and black gets into a cramped position. Instead of taking the pawn on e4, AllieStein preferred to castle. Now knight takes on e4 is actually a threat, and Leela thinks it's best to defend the pawn with the queen from c2. So she takes on c6, and after b takes, queen c2. Taking back on c6 in a different way is not that good. First of all, taking with the queen is very bad because after bishop f4, white is controlling both d6 and b6, and it's very difficult to develop the light-squared bishop without losing at least a pawn. And if knight e4, then knight b6 wins a lot of material after rook a7, bishop b8, bishop takes on c5, bishop takes on a7, bishop takes on b6, and rook c1. The queen doesn't really have options, and best is just bishop takes on a7, rook c6, and white is just much better. Instead of taking back on c6 with the queen, taking back with the d-pawn is also not very pleasant. Black won't be able to play b6 successfully because of the knight on a4, and developing the light-squared bishop on this diagonal after e5 also fails because of f4, f5 stuff. After queen c2, e5, knight b6, rook b8, bishop e3, black can develop the bishop to e6, but it can't stay there for long after f4. f5 is threatened. So AllieStein preferred to develop the bishop to b7, so after knight c6, she took back with the b-pawn. Queen c2, bishop b7, and AllieStein's plan is to play d5, and if the c5 pawn takes en passant, then after c5 the bishop will finally see the world. But as we will see immediately, his excitement will be short-lived. There followed h3, d5, c takes, bishop takes, and now the knight would be very happy on c5, blocking the pawn and keeping the bishop miserable. But after bishop takes on c5 and queen takes, Leela would lose the pawn on e4, so she played bishop f3 to defend it. And now finally AllieStein gets in c5 and all her minor pieces work, but Leela now proceeds on attacking c5 with bishop e3. Knight d7, rook d1, rook c8, rook c1, h6, and now Leela attacks c5 again with b4. AllieStein can't take on b4 because after Leela exchanges everything on c7, the knight on d7 is hanging. So AllieStein had to push the pawn to c4, the only way to keep it. But Leela attacks it now on the c4 square, and the pawn cannot be defended anymore. So AllieStein goes into a variation in which he exchanges the c4 pawn with Leela's b4 pawn, but she also gets into a very nasty pin, which will be her downfall. There followed bishop takes on b4. If AllieStein could play now c3 defending the pawn, she would be very happy, but there's no time for that. Leela played queen b2, attacking the bishop, a5, defending it, but a3, and the bishop has to go back. Bishop takes on c4, and Leela is threatening so many things at once. She's attacking both the bishop on b7 and the knight on d7. The queen is the only piece defending them, but the queen is also in trouble because the line-squared bishop on c4 is threatening to move away, uncovering the rook on c1. AllieStein defended with bishop c6, but after bishop b5, she's in a terrible pin, and as we'll see, she won't be able to solve this problem. Knight b8, defending the bishop, bishop takes, knight takes, and black could solve the pin now by playing queen b8 next, but it is white's turn. Leela played knight b6, forcing the rook away from the defense of the knight on c6, rook d8, rook takes, and now queen c3. Leela has to be careful though, because queen takes on c6 doesn't work yet. Black has the Zwischenzug, rook d1, forcing the rook away from defending the queen. AllieStein continued with bishop f6, queen c2, and bishop g5. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and now since the knight is not defended anymore, queen c5. Taking the knight is still not possible. AllieStein played f6, g3, preparing to play king g2 and get out of the check on d1, king h8, king g2, and since taking the knight now would be possible, AllieStein played rook b8. Now queen takes on c6 would fail to queen takes on b6, but Leela played knight a4. Rook c8, this is now possible since the knight moved away from b6. Queen b5, king h7, h4. Now taking the pawn on h4 would fail because of knight b6, and there's no queen b7 pinning the knight because of queen h5 check, and taking the rook next. AllieStein played queen d6, finally getting out of the pin, and after pawn takes on g5, instead of recapturing immediately, she played knight a7, attacking the queen and finally dissolving the pin. But after check, king g8, queen b7, queen c7, queen b3, she played queen c4, a move that Leela considered a huge blunder. She was expecting queen e5. Now after queen e3, she evaluates the position at +7, pretty much winning. She was expecting queen takes knight on a4, g takes f6, rook c7, queen f4, e5, queen h4, queen c4, f takes on g7, rook takes on g7, with the follow-up queen d8 check, king f7, queen d7 check, king f8, rook h8 check, rook g8, queen d6 check, king e8, queen takes on e5, king d7, rook h7, king c8, rook takes knight, and this is hopeless for black. Instead of taking the knight though, not wanting to go into this, AllieStein played f takes on g5, but now after knight b6, forking queen and rook, Leela evaluates this as +25, AllieStein is around +3 here. And now some weird stuff happened. The game continued with queen c5, queen takes on e3, f takes on e3, and now instead of taking the knight, AllieStein played g4. And after knight takes and e5, she evaluated this position at only +1.8 for white. A disadvantage for black at which normally you still have fighting chances. But I don't see any fighting chances here. This is completely hopeless for black, 2 pieces down. I would beat AllieStein 10 out of 10 in this position, even if it would be held by Leela and Stockfish together. Quite weird. Maybe it's just an evaluation output error, or something wrong with the UI. Anyway, the game continued for another 40-something moves. This is where the fun begins. Leela took her time to finish this game properly. Obviously, you can't rush things at this level. She meticulously prepared the fighting plan and then executed it with the precision of a brain surgeon. First she went for the e5 pawn and then the g4 pawn. These were the easier ones to get. And then she proceeded with centralizing the king. This is a critical maneuver in endings. After g6, she very carefully approached the pawn with the rook from behind and then took it off. All good so far, but now comes the tricky part. Getting the pawn on a4 is a different bowl of beans. The black king is near. So she decides to push the e-pawn and bait the black king closer to it, but the black king doesn't bite. It goes to c3 and after the check attacks the pawn on a3. But after rook d7, the black king gets scared and just moves around the a-pawn. And shortly after that, Leela manages to win black's last pawn. And now we enter the last phase of the game where Leela tries to promote the e-pawn and then mate. But she needs to be very careful not to rush it. You need to prepare the black king for what is to come. If you promote too soon, you might give him a heart attack and then you can't mate it, can you? So Leela is very cautious, but the game was adjudicated in Leela's favor before she managed to finalize the process. But it doesn't matter, a win is a win, and this game was pretty awesome. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other videos. Take care, bye bye.